The letter felt like a cold stone in her palm. Lady Aurelia Finch stood before her father's mahogany desk, a ghost in her own home, chosen for a task precisely because she was forgettable. The silence in the study was like a bell jar, suffocating the very air until it felt too thin to breathe. Her father, Lord Finch, did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the polished surface of his desk, as if admiring the reflection of a man who was not a coward. Her stepmother, a woman whose beauty had sharpened with age into a kind of elegant cruelty, stood by the window, her silhouette a rigid line against the grey London afternoon. "You understand what you are to do," her father said, his voice a low rumble of feigned authority. It was a statement, not a question. Aurelia did not need to speak. Her role was to be a vessel, a silent carrier of a message deemed too dangerous for anyone of consequence to deliver. The message was a rejection, a finely worded, calligraphy-laden refusal of a marriage proposal from the most powerful and notoriously ill-tempered man in England, Alastair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. He had proposed for the hand of Aurelia's younger sister, Rosamond, the diamond of the season, a girl whose laughter was like music and whose face could launch 1,000 hopeful sonnets from 1,000 witless suitors. The Duke, however, was no witless suitor. He was a predator, a man of industry and iron will who had crushed his rivals as easily as one might crush a walnut. And Rosamond, despite the immense advantage of the match, had refused. She had wept, she had screamed, she had declared she would rather enter a convent than marry a man they called the Iron Duke, a man twice her age who was rumoured to have no heart at all. Her father, a man drowning in debt, most of it owed to the Duke himself, had at first been furious, but Rosamond was his jewel, his prized asset. Her tears had eroded his resolve, and now here they were. They had penned a letter of polite, grovelling refusal, and someone had to deliver it. "It is a simple matter of handing him the correspondence," her stepmother added, turning from the window. Her eyes, the same brilliant blue as Rosamond's, swept over Aurelia with dismissive appraisal. They took in the plain brown dress, the hair pulled back in a simple knot, the face that was pleasant but utterly unmemorable. "He will not even register your presence. You will be in and out before he has time to summon his temper." They were sending the mouse to tell the lion he was unwelcome. Aurelia's fingers tightened on the crisp edges of the envelope. She was 5 years older than the beautiful Rosamond, and had long ago accepted her place in the family tapestry, a muted brown thread woven into the background, necessary for structure but never meant to be seen. She was the sensible one, the quiet one, the one who managed the household accounts and ensured the fires were lit. Her presence as constant and as overlooked as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. They did not fear for her safety, she knew. They simply assumed the Duke's rage would be so immense, so focused on the insult itself, that the messenger would be beneath his notice. He would not remember the face of the girl who handed him the end of his ambitions. That was their calculation. That was her purpose. "Go now," her father commanded, finally lifting his eyes to meet hers. There was no warmth in them, only a desperate sort of impatience. "The carriage is waiting." Aurelia gave a small, barely perceptible nod. She did not trust her voice. Words felt like fragile things, easily broken. She turned and left the study, the heavy door closing behind her with a sound of finality. As she walked down the grand, cold hallway of her home, she felt a strange, hollow sort of peace. They were sending her into the fire, but for the first time she felt she had nothing left to burn. The Duke of Blackwood's townhouse was a fortress of grey stone on a square so exclusive that the very air seemed rarefied. It was stark, imposing. and utterly devoid of the fashionable frills that adorned other aristocratic homes. There were no overflowing flower boxes, no brightly painted doors. There was only stone and iron and the unnerving sense of being watched by the tall, dark windows. The butler who opened the door was as austere as the facade. He was a tall, skeletal man with a face that looked as though it had been carved from wood and left out in the rain. He eyed Aurelia's simple attire with a flicker of disdain, but did not comment. "I am Lady Aurelia Finch," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I have a delivery for His Grace." The butler's eyebrow rose a fraction. "The Duke is not receiving. He will receive this," Aurelia insisted, holding up the letter. She was acting on the fumes of a desperate courage she did not know she possessed. To be turned away at the door would be a failure, and she could not imagine returning to her father's study with the letter still in her hand. The butler hesitated, his gaze fixed on the elegant Finch crest on the wax seal. He seemed to weigh the potential wrath of his master for being disturbed against the potential wrath of his master for being denied a letter from this particular family. After a moment of tense silence, he gave a stiff nod. "Wait here," he commanded, and disappeared into the gloom of the house, leaving her standing on the cold marble of the entryway. The interior of the house was as severe as the exterior. The walls were panelled in dark wood, the floors bare and polished to a mirror sheen. There were no portraits of smiling ancestors, no delicate porcelain vases. Instead, the walls were hung with strange diagrams and what looked like architectural blueprints. The air smelled faintly of chemicals and old paper, a scent both clean and unsettling. It was the home of a man who valued function over form, logic over sentiment. After what felt like an eternity, the butler returned. "His Grace will see you. This way." Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She followed the butler down a long corridor, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished floor. He stopped before a heavy oak door and knocked once, a sharp, decisive rap. A voice from within, deep and clear, called, "Enter." The butler opened the door and stepped aside, announcing her with cold formality. "Lady Aurelia Finch." Aurelia stepped into the room and her breath caught in her throat. It was not a study or a drawing room, it was a laboratory. One wall was lined with bookshelves from floor to ceiling, but the others were covered with shelves holding glass beakers, coiled copper wires, and strange, intricate contraptions of brass and wood. In the centre of the room, a massive table was littered with schematics and tools. And standing by that table, wiping his hands on a cloth, was the Duke of Blackwood. He was taller than she had imagined, with broad shoulders that filled out his impeccably tailored but severe black coat. His hair was dark, shot through with surprising strands of silver at the temples, though he could not be much older than 30. His face was all sharp angles and uncompromising lines, a face that belonged on a Roman coin. It was a cold face, a powerful face. He turned to look at her, and his eyes, a dark, warm brown like polished mahogany, held an unnerving intelligence. She noticed his hands. The tips of his fingers were stained a dark, inky black, as if he'd been working with chemicals. "Lady Aurelia," he said. His voice was calm, devoid of any emotion. It was more unnerving than a shout would have been. She curtsied, her body moving with the rigid training of a lifetime. "Your Grace." Her hand trembled slightly as she held out the letter. This was it, the moment of impact. She had rehearsed her lines, a short, polite speech about her sister's delicate constitution and unpreparedness for the marital state. I have come on behalf of my father, Lord Finch, and my sister, Lady Rosamond, she began, her voice a strained whisper. Regarding your most generous, your most esteemed proposal, he did not move to take the letter. He did not even look at it. His gaze remained fixed on her face, his expression unreadable. He let her words hang in the silent, chemical-scented air. She felt her courage begin to fray, the carefully constructed sentences dissolving in her mind. She faltered, her speech dying in her throat. She stood there, arm outstretched, holding the instrument of his fury. He took a step closer, and she flinched. But his movements were slow, deliberate. He stopped a few feet from her, his head tilted slightly as he studied her. The silence stretched, growing heavier with every beat of her heart. She expected him to demand the letter, to rip it from her hand and read its contents before unleashing the legendary temper her family so feared. Instead, he asked a question. It was a simple question, but it struck her with the force of a physical blow, shattering her composure completely. "Tell me, Lady Aurelia," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of command. "Did you wish to come here today?" The question was so unexpected, so entirely off the script she had prepared, that she could only stare at him in stunned silence. He was not asking about Rosamond. He was not asking about her father. He was asking about her. Her, the invisible daughter, the forgettable messenger. In that moment, he was the only person who had ever truly looked at her and asked what she wanted. Her hand, still holding the letter, fell to her side. The carefully rehearsed words, the polite fictions, turned to ash in her mouth. She opened her mouth to speak, to give him the expected courteous lie, but what came out was a small, choked sound that was dangerously close to the truth. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. "No, Your Grace, I did not." A flicker of something, not triumph, not pity, but something like understanding, passed through his dark eyes. He gave a slow nod. "I see," he said. He gestured to a pair of worn leather armchairs near the cold fireplace. "Please sit, the butler will bring tea." He still had not looked at the letter. It remained in her hand, a forgotten artifact from a battle that had failed to materialize. She sank into the chair, her legs suddenly weak. The Duke of Blackwood did not roar. He did not rage. He had simply looked past the message and seen the messenger. And for Aurelia, that was the most terrifying and revolutionary thing that had ever happened. The tea arrived on a silver tray, carried by the silent butler. The Duke prepared her cup himself, his stained fingers moving with a surprising delicacy as he added milk and a single lump of sugar. He handed it to her, his hand brushing hers for a fleeting moment. A strange warmth shot up her arm, a startling jolt of awareness. He settled into the chair opposite her, the cup and saucer looking oddly small in his large hands. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was not the heavy, expectant silence of a moment before, but a quieter, more contemplative one. He seemed to be in no hurry. "Your family believes me to be a man of considerable temper," he stated, his voice neutral. Aurelia's eyes darted to the letter, which she had placed on the small table beside her chair. "They hold you in the highest esteem, Your Grace." The lie was automatic, a reflex honed by years of social necessity. A faint, wry smile touched his lips, gone as quickly as it appeared. "They hold my bank accounts in high esteem. It is not the same thing. They sent you because they were afraid. They thought I would not notice you." The bluntness of his assessment stole her breath. He saw everything so clearly, as if the walls of her family home were made of glass. Shame and a strange sort of relief washed over her. There was no point in pretending with this man. He dealt only in truths. Yes, she admitted, her gaze falling to her lap. That is true. And what do you think, Lady Aurelia? He asked, his tone genuinely curious. Am I a man to be feared? She considered the question. She looked around the strange, Spartan room, at the tools and beakers, the evidence of a mind consumed by inquiry and creation. She looked at his hands, marked not by violence but by work. And she looked at his eyes, which were watching her with a calm, unwavering intensity. He was powerful, yes, intimidating certainly, but she did not feel fear. She felt seen. I think you are a man who values honesty, she said finally, her voice gaining a sliver of confidence. He nodded slowly, taking a sip of his tea. A rare commodity, and an expensive one for some. His eyes flickered towards the letter, then back to her. Your sister, Lady Rosamond, she is considered the most beautiful debutante of the season. She is very beautiful, Aurelia agreed quietly. It was an objective fact, like stating the sky was blue. There was no envy in her voice, only a weary acceptance. Beauty is a currency, the Duke mused, more to himself than to her. But its value fluctuates, it fades. Intelligence, resilience, those are assets that appreciate over time. He set his cup down with a soft click. You enjoy botany, I believe, Aurelia started, her head snapping up. How could you possibly know that? I attended the Allendale ball last month. You spent nearly an hour in the conservatory, away from the dancing. You were sketching the orchids. You have a very precise hand. She stared at him, her mind reeling. She had been at that ball, a wallflower clinging to the edges of the room. Convinced of her own invisibility, she had retreated to the conservatory for a breath of air, for a moment of peace with the only companions who did not judge her, the flowers. She had taken out her small sketchbook and pencil, thinking no one was paying her the slightest attention. But he had been there. He had seen her. The most powerful man in the room had noticed the invisible girl hiding amongst the plants. You saw me? She stammered. I make it a point to see things others overlook, he replied simply. He rose from his chair and walked to one of the tall bookshelves. After a moment, he pulled down a large, leather-bound portfolio and brought it to the table. He opened it, revealing a series of stunningly detailed botanical prints. A shared interest, it would seem. She leaned forward, forgetting her nervousness, captivated by the images on the pages. They were exquisite, rendered with a scientist's precision and an artist's eye. But they were not prints. As she looked closer, she realized they were photographs, captured in sharp, monochromatic detail. You made these? She whispered in awe. It is a private hobby, a field of study that requires patience, precision, and a great deal of light, he said. He turned a page, revealing a photograph of an impossibly delicate, almost translucent orchid. The ghost orchid. Dendrophylax lindeni. Exceedingly rare, it has no leaves and can go for years without flowering. Aurelia's hand flew to the small locket she always wore around her neck. Inside it was not a portrait, but a tiny pressed flower, faded with age. A ghost orchid, given to her by her mother long ago. It was her most treasured possession. How could he possibly know? It felt like he was not just observing her, but reading the hidden pages of her soul. She spent another hour in his study, the untouched rejection letter lying forgotten on the table between them. He spoke of chemistry and optics, of the way silver nitrate reacted to light to capture a moment in time. She, in turn, found herself speaking of root systems and pollination, of the quiet, resilient world of plants that had always been her refuge. For the first time in her life, she was not Rosamond's plain sister or Lord Finch's overlooked daughter. She was simply Aurelia, a woman with a mind and interests of her own, speaking to a man who was genuinely listening. When the grandfather clock in the distant hall chimed 4, she realised with a jolt how long she had been there. She stood abruptly, a blush rising on her cheeks. "Your Grace, I have kept you far too long. I must go." He rose as well, his expression giving nothing away. Of course, she reached for the letter, her duty suddenly crashing back down on her. The letter he held up a hand, stopping her. "Leave it," he said. "It is of no consequence." She stared at him, confused, but, "My father, my sister, the business of this letter is concluded," he said, his tone final. He walked her to the door of the study, the austere butler appearing as if from nowhere to escort her out. At the threshold, the Duke paused. "Lady Aurelia," he said, his voice low. "Thank you for your honesty." And then he closed the door, leaving her alone in the silent hallway, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and a strange, unfamiliar spark of hope. She had arrived as a messenger, and she was leaving as a mystery. The days that followed were thick with a strange, anxious silence. Aurelia returned home to find her family had already retired for the evening. She crept to her room, the Duke's dismissal of the letter echoing in her mind. She had failed in her task, yet she did not feel like a failure. She felt awakened. Her family did not ask her for details the next morning. They saw she had returned unharmed, and the letter was gone from her possession. They assumed the deed was done. They seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the Duke's retribution to fall. They expected financial ruin, public humiliation, a storm of wrath that would shatter their fragile social standing. But nothing happened. The days bled into a week. No angry letters arrived. No creditors appeared at the door demanding immediate payment. The Duke of Blackwood was silent. The city's gossip columns, usually so quick to seize on any scandal, reported nothing. It was as if the proposal had never been made. The suspense began to wear on her family. Her father grew more irritable, his face pale with worry. Her stepmother's sharp tongue became even sharper. Rosamond, relieved of the terrifying match, grew bored and complained endlessly of the oppressive quiet in the house. They began to look at Aurelia with a new suspicious curiosity. What had happened in that house? What had she said? Aurelia offered them nothing. She retreated into herself, replaying her conversation with the Duke over and over. He had seen her. He had listened to her. He had shown her his work, his passion. The memory of it was a small, warm coal glowing in the cold hearth of her life. She took out her sketchbook more often, her drawings becoming bolder, more confident. She felt a subtle shift within herself, a quiet unfurling of a self she had kept tightly furled for years. A week after her visit, a footman delivered a small, flat package addressed to her. Her name, Lady Aurelia Finch, was written in a strong, precise hand. Her stepmother eyed the package with suspicion as Aurelia took it up to her room. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a photograph. It was the image of the ghost orchid from his portfolio, a stunningly beautiful, silver-toned print. Tucked beneath it was a simple, thick card. On it were only a few words. "Patience is rewarded. Blackwood, Aurelia's heart soared." It was not a love letter. It was not a courtship. It was a correspondence. A conversation, continued a recognition. She hid the photograph in a locked drawer with her mother's locket, a secret treasure that was hers alone. Her newfound peace was shattered a few days later. A letter arrived from her father, though they lived in the same house. It was slipped under her door, a formal, cold summons. She found him waiting in his study, her stepmother at his side, her face a mask of fury. "What is the meaning of this?" her father demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. He threw a letter down on the desk. It was from his solicitor. Aurelia picked it up. Her eyes scanned the legalistic language, but the meaning was clear. The Duke of Blackwood had not forgiven Lord Finch's debts. Instead, he had purchased them outright from all of her father's other creditors. He now held every last penny of their financial ruin in his hand. The letter from the solicitor was a polite but firm notification that all assets of the Finch estate were now effectively under the Duke's control, pending repayment, an impossible sum. "He is destroying us," her stepmother hissed, her voice venomous. "This is his revenge for Rosamond's rejection." "What did you do? What did you say to him to bring this upon us?" The accusation struck Aurelia with cold force. They believed this was her fault. They believed her failure as a messenger had brought about their ruin. Her father's face was ashen. He looked at her not as a daughter, but as the cause of his downfall. "He said nothing of this to me," Aurelia said, her voice a whisper. "He was courteous." "Courteous?" Her stepmother laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The man is gutting us like a fish, and you call him courteous? You were supposed to be invisible, insignificant. You must have provoked him somehow. Insolence from a plain little mouse like you would be just the thing to ignite his pride." The cruelty of the words barely registered. All Aurelia could think of was the Duke's calm face, his intelligent eyes. This action felt calculated. It was a move on a chessboard, but she could not yet see the purpose. It did not feel like petty revenge. It felt like something else entirely. "You will go back to him," her father commanded, his desperation making him cruel. "You will go back and you will grovel. You will beg him for mercy on behalf of your sister, on behalf of this family." "No," Aurelia said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a dropped stone. Her father and stepmother stared at her as if she had grown a second head. She had never defied them before. "Never, what did you say?" Her father breathed, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I will not go," she repeated, a strange strength flowing through her. This was not his game. This was hers. This is not about Rosamond. And it is not about mercy. Before they could recover from their shock, she turned and walked out of the study, leaving them speechless in her wake. She went to her room, her mind racing. The Duke was not a vengeful man, he was a strategic one. This was not an act of destruction, it was an act of isolation. He had cut her family off, financially severing their control over their own lives, and by extension over hers. A thought, wild and terrifying, began to form in her mind. He was clearing the board. She knew what she had to do. She packed a small valise, her hands steady. She took the Duke's photograph of the orchid and her own sketchbook. She wrote a short, simple note for her family, leaving it on her pillow. Then, slipping out of the house like a thief in the night, she hailed a public cab and gave the driver the address for the Duke of Blackwood's townhouse. She was no longer a messenger. She was a player in the game, and she was about to make her own move. The butler opened the door, his wooden face showing the barest flicker of surprise at seeing her on the doorstep, alone, with a valise in her hand. It was late, the gas lamps of the square casting long shadows on the pavement. "I must see the Duke," she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for refusal. This time he did not make her wait in the hall. He led her directly to the laboratory. The Duke was there, as she knew he would be. He was not working with his chemicals, but was seated in one of the leather armchairs, reading a book under the light of a single lamp. He looked up as she entered, his expression calm, as if he had been expecting her. "Lady Aurelia," he said, closing his book but not rising. "An unexpected visit." "You have ruined my father," she said, her voice trembling despite her resolve. She stood in the centre of the room, her valise a dead weight at her side. "I have consolidated his debts," he corrected mildly. "It is a simple matter of business." "It is not business," she shot back, her control finally snapping. "It is a punishment. It is your revenge." He was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face in the lamplight. "And you believe I would go to such elaborate lengths to exact revenge on a man I barely respect, for the rejection of a girl I barely know?" His logic was a cold splash of water, dousing the fire of her accusation. He was right. It made no sense. Then why? She whispered, her anger deflating into confusion. "Why do this?" He finally rose from his chair and walked towards her. He stopped before her, so close she could see the flecks of gold in his dark brown eyes. "The proposal I sent to your father was a message," he said, his voice low and intense. "But it was not intended for your sister. It was intended for you." Aurelia's mind went blank. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. For me? I do not understand." "I knew your father," he explained, his gaze unwavering. "I knew he was a desperate man, but a proud one. I knew he prized his beautiful daughter above all else. And I knew with absolute certainty that when it came time to deliver a rejection he was too cowardly to deliver himself. He would not risk his prize. He would send the person he valued the least. He would send the daughter he believed to be invisible." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "The proposal was a key, Lady Aurelia, forged to unlock a single door, the door to this room. I did not want to marry Lady Rosamond. I wanted to have a single, honest conversation with you, away from the avarice and ambition of your family." It was all there, the strange questions, the disinterest in the letter, his knowledge of her habits. It was an elaborate, audacious and utterly mad plan. He had risked scandal and speculation and had set in motion a financial takeover, all on the gamble that her father would act according to his flawed character. All just to speak with her. "You have been observing me," she breathed, the realization dawning. "At the ball, other places, for almost a year," he admitted. "I saw a mind trapped behind a wall of filial duty. I saw a quiet resilience that was more compelling than any manufactured charm. I saw a woman who deserved to be seen. He had orchestrated everything. He was a master strategist, and the board was not London society, but her very life. He had laid his entire plan bare, exposing his own manipulations, his own unorthodox pursuit. He was vulnerable now, his motives revealed. He had given her all the power. The knowledge of his machinations was a weapon she could use against him, or a bridge she could choose to cross. "And my father's debts?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Consolidating them, what was that for?" "That," he said, a hint of steel returning to his voice, "was to ensure they could no longer make decisions for you. Your father would have sold you to the highest bidder eventually, once Rosamond was safely married off. I have simply removed him as a broker in your life. You are now, for the first time, entirely free to make your own choice." He stood before her, the powerful Iron Duke, a man who bent the world to his will, and he waited. He had made his move. Now it was her turn. The choice was hers. The sound of shouting from the entryway shattered the charged silence in the laboratory. The Duke's head turned towards the door, his expression hardening. A moment later, the butler appeared, his wooden composure finally cracked. He looked flustered. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. Lord Finch and his wife are here. They are demanding to see their daughter." Aurelia's blood ran cold. They had found her note. They had followed her. Her last desperate act of defiance had led them straight to her, ready to drag her back into the cage she had just escaped. "Let them in, Davies," the Duke said, his voice dangerously calm. He turned back to Aurelia. "It seems your choice must be made sooner than I anticipated." Her father and stepmother burst into the room, their faces contorted with rage. They stopped short upon seeing Aurelia standing not with a captor, but with the Duke himself, an unspoken intimacy in the space between them. "Aurelia," her father bellowed, finding his voice first. "What is the meaning of this? You will come home at once. You have caused enough trouble." "She will do no such thing," the Duke stated, his voice cutting through her father's bluster like a razor. "This is a family matter, Blackwood," her stepmother snapped, her eyes flashing. "You have no right to interfere. You have ruined us, and now you seek to steal our daughter." Aurelia looked from her parents' furious, frightened faces to the Duke's calm, waiting one. For her entire life they had written her story. She was the plain daughter, the quiet spinster, the forgotten one. They had authored her past and had intended to author her future, but the Duke had not offered her a new story. He had simply handed her a blank page and a pen. All the fear, all the years of silent resentment coalesced into a single clarifying point of courage. She held the truth. She knew her family's cowardice, and she knew the Duke's audacious, stunning motive. She could expose them all, lay their shabby motivations bare for him to see. Or she could do something else. She could choose her future instead of dwelling on her past. She took a step forward, away from the Duke and towards her parents. They watched her, expecting tears, pleading, submission. "I am not returning with you," she said, her voice clear and steady. It resonated in the quiet room with the pure, unwavering tone of a bell. Her father stared, his mouth agape. Aurelia, she did not let him finish. She turned her back on them, a definitive, final gesture. She walked back to the Duke, stopping directly in front of him. She looked up into his intelligent, waiting eyes, and the entire world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the warm lamplight of his strange, wonderful laboratory. "Your Grace," she said, her voice ringing with a certainty that came from the very core of her being, "I believe we have a wedding to plan." The shock on her parents' faces was a spectacle of gaping mouths and widened eyes. Her stepmother let out a small, strangled gasp. Her father looked as though he had been struck. They had sent her to deliver a rejection. And she had just accepted a proposal that had never been truly offered to her sister. She had not waited to be chosen. She had claimed the choice for herself. The Duke's stern face broke, just for a second. His smile, when it finally appeared, was like the first winter thaw, small and hesitant but promising warmth. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and transforming his severe features into something else entirely. He said nothing, simply offered her his arm. She took it. The fine wool of his coat was solid and real beneath her fingers. As he led her from the room, away from her stunned and defeated family, he leaned down, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "Are you certain, Aurelia?" "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," she whispered back. He led her not to the drawing room, but back into the heart of his world, towards a small door at the back of the laboratory. It opened into a dark room, the air thick with the scent of chemicals. A single, safe, red light glowed in the corner. In this private, hidden space, he turned to face her. He gently cupped her face with his stained hands, his touch surprisingly soft. He looked at her for a long moment, as if memorizing her features, and then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, but one of quiet, profound recognition. It was a kiss that tasted of certainty, a sealing of a bargain made not between families or fortunes, but between two minds who had finally found their equal. Her family's expectations fell away from her like a shed snakeskin, old and useless. She was home. 1 year later, Aurelia, now the Duchess of Blackwood, stood in the centre of a vast glass conservatory at their country estate. Sunlight streamed through the panes, illuminating the thousands of shades of green from the collection of rare and exotic plants she now curated. The air was warm and humid, filled with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. Her sketchbook lay open on a wrought iron table, a half-finished drawing of a new hybrid rose on its page. The cold, austere townhouse in London was a distant memory. She had filled this house and his life with light and colour and quiet, growing things. The door opened and Alistair entered. He wore no coat, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and his fingers, she noted with a fond smile, were still faintly stained. He came to stand beside her, his arm wrapping around her waist as he looked out over the world she had built. "The new lens arrived from Germany," he said, his voice a low, familiar rumble against her ear. "The resolution is remarkable. I believe we can finally capture the pollen on the lip of the Phalaenopsis. You and your endless quest for detail," she teased gently, leaning her head against his shoulder. Their life had settled into a rhythm of shared passions, his for capturing the world, hers for cultivating it. They were partners in every sense of the word. "Detail is everything," he countered softly. "It's how one tells the difference between what is merely beautiful and what is truly rare." He tilted her chin up, his mahogany eyes warm with an affection that no longer hid behind a wall of severity. "It's how I found you." She smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached her eyes. She thought of her family, who she had not seen since that night. Her father, his debts settled by a generous but strictly businesslike allowance from Alistair, had retired to the country with his wife and Rosamond. They were solvent but irrelevant, stripped of their power to command or control. They had faded into the background of her life, muted threads in a tapestry she was now weaving herself. Alistair had given her freedom, but she was the one who had been brave enough to step through the door he opened. He had seen her when no one else had bothered to look, but she had been the one to recognise the truth of him behind the fearsome reputation. Love, she had discovered, was not always a lightning strike. Sometimes it was a slow, quiet process of discovery. Sometimes it was about being seen, truly and completely, for the very first time.